Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about race in the 21st century. So the book opens up talking about social problems attached to race, such as inequality, privilege, and oppression. One big thing is, where does this all come from? We have to have a general understanding of where racism comes from to really begin to study this class. So again, during the age of European colonization, the English and the Spanish and the French and the German, they were dividing up society and they were taking over the upper classes of all of the economic systems across the world that they could get their hands on, essentially. Okay? So the European goal was for domination, and then on a class level, dominating the upper classes to become the bourgeoisie. Okay? So in the process, women were already excluded from being able to compete. Now remember, this is also the rise of capitalism, so the origin of all of this has to do with economics. So, because of capitalism and the goal of capitalism for the bourgeoisie, the owners, is to consolidate capital into the hands of the few. Women were already oppressed. 50% of the people could not compete as it was. But then Europeans were like, how do we further remove competition? So they came up with racial categories to have very clear-cut lines as to who's allowed to be in what social class, who's allowed to participate in the economic and social markets, and who's allowed to rise up the social class ladder. So the origin of race, again, as we've talked about many times, is economics, okay? It's all about money. So because races were created, then the experience of race became real, but also the oppression, the restriction into the lower classes attached to race became real. Therefore, you had inequality between the European bourgeoisie and the lower classes, which included females. I mean, again, women at this time could have an association through their husband, but they were technically owned by their husband. And even in the United States, up until through the Civil War, women just counted as part of their husband's citizenship, for example. So again, even though someone who was light-skinned and identified as white and had an upper-class husband, the female themselves didn't also have power. So essentially, white male Europeans were able to take over the elite social positions. This doesn't mean that all white male Europeans had privilege, access to be able to rise up the social class ladder. But it meant that if you were white and you were male, you at least had a chance to rise up the social class ladder without being oppressed based upon your sex or your race. Over time, Europeans then constructed a society in which racism is a premise because non-whites were restricted from being able to participate in society. This became institutionalized racism over time because then systems and structures, including the bureaucracy of society, including the government, media, and other institutions, they became restrictive to non-whites. So the idea of institutionalized racism is restriction of non-whites from, all those other government services and other assets of society. Okay? The book defines colorblind racism as the idea that racism has gone away. This comes about because over hundreds of years you had major social movements that were trying to get racial equity, and then culminating in the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s, okay? So since the 1960s, it became illegal to discriminate against somebody else. And so a lot of people think, for example, that racism is gone because all rights are balanced. However, then we point to institutionalized racism, and we demonstrate that people that are non-white get hired more. Males get hired more than females, for example, okay? Now, minority well-being has been increasing as inequality between races has reduced, as white privilege has been reduced because more women and minorities can compete in the economic markets, for example, and gender inequality has gone down. However, still, whites have more power, more life chances, more access to education and job prestige and wealth than non-whites still to this day, okay? Now, this comes about simply because of prejudice and discrimination. Just because the Civil Rights Acts were passed doesn't mean that prejudice completely went away or discrimination went away, okay? Prejudice still exists. This is why we have to have things like Black Lives Matter movements to demonstrate, prejudice and discrimination in society. Discrimination still exists, and you can find this by looking at hiring practices and mortgage acceptance rates between races, for example. Whites have 7 times more wealth than minorities in modern times. And again, this comes from hundreds of years of whites having privilege to attain capital for themselves and restrict others from gaining capital. And it also has to do with the reproduction of social classes through institutional racism, whereupon those that have power maintain their power, and they, whether it's overtly or covertly, reduce people and keep them into the lower classes, for example. So therefore, if whites have controlled all the power and all the people doing all the hiring are whites, and whites have implicit bias and prejudice toward non-whites, are they going to be hiring more whites, which then just reproduces a class culture of whites dominating? Okay? Other examples of this include higher imprisonments and being pulled over and being searched for non-whites, despite the fact that whites are the majority of people in the United States and they tend to commit more crimes and are 2 times more likely to have drugs and contraband in the car than a non-white. Again, if police were to engage in targeting based upon races, they would and should be targeting white people, again, because they're more likely to have guns and drugs in the car, for example. Individualistic fallacy. The book talks about all the different types of fallacies that we tend to assume attached to racism. So here's the list. Individualistic fallacy says that ending racist ideas and attitudes, negative stereotypes, can end racism. What they don't see, even though you can change the hearts and minds, institutional racism still exists, and that goes into who still has control of the economic markets, who's in control of the hiring practices. Are they truly engaging in inclusion and diversity in their hiring practices, for example? Legalistic fallacy is the belief that since we've ended legal racism, racism is over, and that's not true, again, because prejudice and discrimination still exists. The tokenistic fallacy is the idea that, well, if you see somebody who's, like President Obama, for example, or Tiger Woods, 1 or 2 people in power, you assume racism has gone away. But then if you look at what race the actual people are of the boards of CEO companies, you're going to find that they're virtually all white and all male. The ahistorical fallacy is the idea that the past does not affect the present, but that's not true. Our present is built upon the past, and our past are the people that came up with these racist ideologies, and these have been culturally reproduced from generation to generation, and this is still continuing to this day. If prejudice and discrimination did not exist, again, you wouldn't find things like police brutality against non-whites due to prejudice and discrimination. Fixed fallacy is the idea that racism remains constant and unchangeable over time. Again, this is false. Yes, we don't have the overt forms of racism and slavery and the Chinese Exclusion Act and all the other number of ways that we've tried to exclude people from participating in the markets. However, modern times, you're not allowed to have covert racism, but people still tend to be overtly racist. Like there was a story in Mississippi where a pastor denied someone from being married because one identified as black and one identified as white. And it got slammed on social media, and those people literally just had to close down and run out of town. But the idea is people still have these racist attitudes. It's just not really accepted so much in covert and overt ways. So again, as we opened up this lecture, we talked about racial domination and how was it that whites were able to gain all the power in society. And again, if you want to know where somebody is located in the social class ladder, it's a simple math equation with a bunch of variables that are all intersectional, which we're about to talk about. So it's just your education plus your job prestige plus your wealth plus your cultural and social capital plus your race, your sex, your religion, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, all of these things play into whether or not you can rise up the social class ladder and where you are located in the social class ladder, okay? So again, historically, the Europeans already had removed females from competing. They came up with racial categories so they can make sure that no one else could compete for social and economic positions. In this way, Europeans were able to dominate the upper classes. And again, those with privilege were able to dominate the upper classes. Privilege, again, being defined as the ability, the access to rising up the social class ladder. Access to education, access to jobs, access to wealth, access to property, access to elite social positions that have a high status attached to them. Okay? So, and again, this was further accomplished with violence, going in and conquering, laws that restricted people from even voting or even being a whole person. Again, our Constitution did not even consider a female a person, and they did not consider someone that was non-white, non-European a whole person. And then ideology. Okay, again, racist ideology that one race is superior to another based upon anything they could come up with back in the day that was totally unscientific. The idea of, again, scientific racism was people going out trying to prove that one race was superior to another, and as we're going to show, that is totally not the case. Again, institutional racism still exists. This is covert in modern times. It's hiring practices, mortgage rates, politicians, who gets to become president. Okay, interpersonal racism is like when you're interacting with other people, those forms of racism. And then symbolic racism or symbolic violence is all people, no matter what race you are biased due to the socialization process and internalization of society and social values. Again, guys, whether or not you know it, when you were a kid, you were being told all of this stuff, and you were just internalizing it all. As that whole adage is that, children are just like sponges, right? You guys are just absorbing stuff. Well, where do kids learn to be racist? They learn it from their racist parents and their racist grandparents and their racist friends around them. Kids in nature do not realize that they're black or white. They're told they're black or white. Then they're told the stereotypes attached to being black or white. And again, then they learn the negative and positive stereotypes also. Intersectionality was created by Crenshaw, and Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 started arguing, this actually comes out of law, not sociology or any other field, out of law, saying that the laws are only representative of white females and are not representative of black females because white females and black females tend to have completely different experiences, even though they share some similar traits, because of the compounding idea that a black female experiences both sexism and racism, and a white female only experiences sexism. So Kimberly Crenshaw was demanding that the laws represent not only the needs of black or white women, but also the needs of black women, which often encounter a whole different set of variables that need to be accounted for. Okay? It has since been adopted in all fields because it starts to demonstrate that all of the groups you identify with compound, and where you're located within these groups is then associated with your social class location. Again, what group do you belong to when it comes to sex, male or female? Historically, males had power. What group do you belong to when it comes to race? Black, white, Asian, Latin American, Native American. Okay, the whites tended to have power. Which group do you belong to? Straight or heterosexual or non-heterosexual? Heterosexuals tend to have power. Which group do you belong to? Protestants or Catholics? Protestants tend to have power. Okay, and so depending on where you're located within these groups, again, it's like a math equation. If you're a white, male, Christian, heterosexual, again, those people tended to have the most access because of the color of their skin, their sex, heteronormativity in society, etc. Okay, so each group identification and compounding identifications also create unique experiences. Again, can a white male relate to a black male? Can a white male relate to a black female? Can a male even relate to a female? Are males and females actually different? I'm not going to get into that today, but take a psychology class of mine, and I'll be talking about that obsessively. Are men and women blank slates? Or is your biology associated with the way you behave and differences between men and women? Or is it just a socialization process? And the same thing goes with race. When it comes to men and women, it's much more complicated because there's more biological variables associated with biological determinism than there are with the idea of nurturing, where the social context is associated with the way the brain functions. But when it comes to race, it's all about the socialization process. Again, the only reason people would be acting slightly different because they're black or they're white is because they've learned to through the social context and the socialization process. Now, Kimberly Crenshaw uses a house as a demonstration of how the groups you identify with are associated with your ability to rise up the social class ladder. So imagine a house. Whites are on the ground floor, okay? Black males are in the basement, but imagine there's like a tiny door that allows people to get up the basement. Okay, white females and black males, because they only have one status, either racism or sexism, kind of had their heads peeping out a little bit. And then they're standing on the shoulders of the black females because a black female has two compounding forms of potential isms, racism and sexism against them. And so the whites and they're all standing on the backs of the black female. And again, the analogy in the book is way better and I could never do it justice. I generally think about it as a theater light analogy, okay? So imagine you have a theater light, okay? And a white male, there's no filter, complete access to rising up the social class ladder. But a white female and a black male have one filter over it. You know, maybe red for sex and green for race. Just one. But a black female looks through not only the light, but also the green and the red, the two compounding filters of both racism and sexism. And then a lesbian black female might have three filters, you know, red and green, and then a blue over the top for sexual orientation. And again, this is the idea that who has more access. So depending upon the potential isms, racism, sexism, ethnocentrism, heterosexism, depending on how many groups that you identify with that you don't have status with, that could be potential forms of prejudice and discrimination you might experience. So white males are never going to experience racism, sexism, heterosexism, any of those. A black male may likely experience racism. A white female may likely experience sexism. A black female may likely both experience racism and sexism. A lesbian black female might experience racism, sexism, and heterosexism. Okay, and then a Muslim black lesbian female might experience ethnocentrism, racism, sexism, and heterosexism. Biological basis for race. Look, this is the hardest conversation ever, but no one is actually white, black, or Asian. Those are all total myths. You do not have a race. We're just human. Look at the book. There is no biological basis for our current racial categories. Racial categories do not accurately group people together according to biological traits. You would need thousands of races to even come close to accounting for some kind of potential variability in genetics, but even that doesn't really work, even if we had thousands, okay? Genetics are counterintuitive. You need more diversity within a group than you do between a group. So look, if you think you're white, you have more in common with someone in Africa than the person that's white next door to you. That might not make any sense. But that's how genetics works. You need that more diversity with your neighbor so that you don't create physical impairments in the children than you do between someone with Africa. So again, whites have more in common genetically with Africans than they do other whites. There are virtually no distinguishable marks between races in the genome, genes and chromosomes. It makes zero sense when you account for biological traits. Quoted from your book, race does not exist on the genetic level. Scientists cannot see race by examining humans' DNA strands. This finding is nothing new. We have known this forever, that you are not black or white. I am not the first person to say it. In Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race, a book published in 1942, physical anthropologist Ashley Montagu demonstrated that race is not a biologically sound concept, and long before Montagu wrote his book, Charles Darwin, the founder of modern-day biology, proclaimed that race has no biological grounding. Intellectual ability. There is no association between race and intelligence, but there is with poverty, guys, and whether or not the kids had food. That's what matters when it comes to IQ. But look, here's the problem. If you stick entire groups into the lower classes like women and other races, you are denying them the ability for their brain to grow. People need to be challenged. They need not only the natural growth, but also the ability to go to a good school, because that is actually associated with your intelligence. That's the psychological basis for IQ. Give a kid some food, a hug, and a good school, and all people will be pretty close to each other. There are some genetic variability with IQ, but not about race. It's just that some people actually genetically are slightly smarter than each other. We're not in a psychology class, though, so I'm not going to go deep into that. But it has nothing to do with race. Okay, I'm just going to yell that so many more times. Cool. Whiteness. Whiteness, as your book says, is racial domination normalized, okay? Becoming white has become normalized over time. White privilege came about when Europeans wanted to dominate society. They came up with races, and they gave privilege to themselves and denied it to others. White anti-racists bank on their privilege. What do you check if you want the job? If I want a job, do I check the white box? That's white anti-racism, because you know checking that white box will give you that job 2 times to everyone over someone who's black. That's because of institutional discrimination. Racial identity. Guys, your identity, your race is a huge part of who you are. It's been socialized. It's a major pillar of your identity. Again, we're not in a psychology class, but the experience of race is real. So not only does it influence your identity, but it's associated with your personality, because the social context is associated with your personality. So yes, race is a social reality. Okay? Your book talks about races being part phenotype, observable characteristics like skin color and hair, but also ancestry such as country of origin. Okay? Racial classifications are not universal. In America, we have white, black, Asian, Native American, and other. In Brazil, they have blanco, pardo, preto, amarelo, indigenia. I had to put these in here because I can't even remember all the different races. They have something called the color gradient. It's just about how white you are. In China, it's about blood purity and brain size. I can't even begin to get into the biology to try to understand how they have come up with that classification. Globally, race is not universal. Again, someone who's African doesn't know they're black until they come to America, so do not call an African black unless they self-identify as black. Again, race is socially constructed. We're the ones who came up with it. Race is a phenomenon of culture, and it's a Western culture thing. It's racial classifications like black and white do not exist in other countries. We created race. Applying symbolic interactionism is the idea that society is constructed and meaning is constructed by interacting with other people, using symbols, language to communicate. We use symbols and language to come up with it, okay? Our racial classification system is flawed. There's only 5 categories and nothing about it makes any sense. They actually all they ever even think about in the ARC racial classifications is what country did you come from, because that's all that matters. If you're from India, you're Asian. If you're from Russia, for some reason, you're white. If you're from North Africa, you're white. Middle East, you're white. Nothing about it makes any sense, okay? The only reason you think you're black, white, Asian, or Native American is because you were told you belong to one of these racial groups. Did you ever ask whether or not you actually do? Is race permanent? Guys, race is brand new. It didn't exist 300 years ago. Just get rid of it. It's an outdated software that doesn't make any sense. Why do people think races are natural? Because you've been told your whole life that race is a thing and it's real. I'm telling you it's not. Read the book. It's all in there. Reciprocal typification is the idea that social realities and constructs come about as people interact and we all agree with each other that race is real. Stop agreeing that race is real, it goes away. Race versus ethnicity. Race is based upon biology. Ethnicity is all about culture, way of life, nation of origin, ideologies. Now, how did races and cultures become segregated? and separate because we segregated people into groups. Whites didn't mix with Africans, and Africans weren't mixing with people that were Jewish in the United States. That's how you ended up with Jewish culture and African culture and white culture and black culture, and it all got blended, but it's time for us to become multicultural and all hang out and get along and get to know each other again, because that's how you can end racism or just get rid of the category itself. So again, how do you apply sociology and the sociological imagination to race? We look at systems and structures that enable and block action. Again, white privilege enables white people to rise up the social class ladder, and racial categories only exist to maintain that separation between who can access stuff and who couldn't. We look at the socialization process for why you think you have a race and why it's part of your identity and where you learned about race. Again, I like to ask questions like, what do you call someone who's Mexican? Hispanic? Do they actually want to be called that? What do you call someone Native American? Native American, American Indian, Cherokee? What's proper? Chinese, Asian? Does someone from China even know they're Asian until they come here? An African person, do you call them black, or are they going to get mad at you? Do they even know they're black until they come to the U.S.? Most Africans don't know they're black until they're walking around a store and some security guard starts following them, and then they start to understand. That's a huge theme from everybody from Africa I've ever talked to on this subject. Again, intersectionality is the idea that race does not exist in isolation. Race came about for economic purposes so Europeans could dominate the upper classes and subjugate everybody else into the lower classes. It's all about money. Y'all have a great week, and thank you so much.